Okay, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chad Costa, and I'm the Vice President of Sales for Traxo. And over the past few months, we've been getting together on our Travel Manager office hours webinars, discussing different topics from different vantage points in the travel industry. Today, we are going to be discussing two highly important topics that have, I don't want to say resurfaced, but really have kind of bubbled to the top of our world. One being duty of care, the other being data privacy, and how to balance traveler safety and security and privacy. So before we get started and we go into our webinar, and for those of you that aren't too familiar with Traxo, Traxo automatically tracks all corporate travel activity, whether they book through your TMC or directly with suppliers in one place in real time. Our focus is to turn every corporate travel program into a strategic asset by delivering complete booking visibility and control to travel managers. The Office Hours webinar is part of a series to help corporate travel managers down this path so they can turn their program into a strategic asset for their company. We will be doing more of these. It's going to be a continuing series with a variety of panelists so the different perspectives can be resonant in the corporate travel community. These events are coming up in the next couple of weeks, so please keep a lookout for your inboxes. A bit of housekeeping, the webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to view it again if you enjoyed it, or if you know someone that missed it, you can share it with colleagues, friends, maybe your mom if she wants it. I know my mom loved to hear. So over the past few months, we've heard from a number of industry experts from different corners of the ecosystem, and today is no exception. We've lined up two world-class thought leaders to discuss their views on duty of care and data privacy, including ideas on how we should approach these topics and implement them as we navigate into the future. So joining us today are Bruce McKindo and Sterling Miller. Bruce is a recognized leader in risk management technology and intelligence. A world-aware founder, Bruce has been the key contributor to the company's strategic growth, securing its position as a leader in business resiliency with the development of the WorldQ Global Control Center. Prior to joining WorldAware, Bruce was the founder and CEO of CSSI, an Inc. 500 and four-time Washington Technology Fast 50 company that developed systems for the intelligence community. He's also served as the lead architect on intelligence programs for the United States government. Welcome, Bruce. Sterling Miller has enjoyed a wide, varied 30-year legal career. He's a three-time general counsel, having served in that role at Silicon Valley-based Marketo, as well as travel-based and industry giant Sabre and Travelocity. In January of 2019, after leading the legal team that completed the sale of Marketo to Adobe, he returned to Dallas to the office of Hilgers Graven PLLC as senior counsel, where he focuses on litigation, general corporate matters, and data privacy. Sterling earned his law degree from WashU in St. Louis with honors, and his bachelor's degree from Nebraska Wesleyan University, certified in data privacy by the IAPP and CIPP US. He began working on data privacy issues in his mid-90s. So I think, as you can probably figure out, these are the perfect panelists for today's discussion. So moving on to the agenda, gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Morning, Chad. Thanks.
And what we're going to do is we're going to kick it off with Sterling to talk on the data privacy piece, then migrate over to Bruce to finalize it with duty of care. We are going to be doing a Q&A, so please submit your questions on the Q&A feature on the application as well as the chat. I will be in the background kind of tallying those up, and for the last hopefully 30, 35, or 25 minutes we can go through that. And then Bruce and Sterling are going to share their closing thoughts. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Sterling.
All right. Thank you, Chad. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, perhaps, wherever you might be. I'm Sterling Miller, and I am at Hilgers Graven. And we're going to talk a little bit today about data privacy. And I'm going to touch on a little bit of duty of care, but then let Bruce handle most of that. So let's kick it off to the first, please. You know, as Chad alluded to, it's hard to find a hotter topic today than data privacy or data security. It seems it's the new it girl, the new black, whatever you want to say. It's just uber prominent. And I can assure you, as having been recently an in-house lawyer and now as an outside counsel, We are frantically trying to get our arms around all of the changes to data privacy regulations around the world. It seems every day, every week, there's something new going on. The only constant is that it's been constantly changing, and it's been this way for years. And we're just trying to make sense of what's coming and what is actually here today. Now, when we talk about corporate travel, so both we talk about travel, both corporate and personal, it touches a lot of different lines, including data privacy and data security, and it certainly concerns any corporation. It involves the travel managers, it involves the human resources department, finance, legal, corporate security, you name it. It's not just isolated to either the travel management team or the legal department. And of course, for the past few months now, we've been living with COVID-19 and all the challenges that that has presented both to legal departments and to corporate travel managers. So just more fun. Next slide, please. So let's start with data privacy. And I can remember back in the mid 90s, as Chad alluded to, I am not in my mid 90s, but I was working in the mid 90s. There were maybe a handful of countries that had data privacy laws, and now we're up well over 100 that have adopted some. And what you see across the spectrum is there are some data privacy laws which you can categorize as comprehensive, and they sit at the national level, meaning they kind of cover everything going on in that country or group of countries. And great examples would be Europe, Japan, Israel, Brazil. Some countries have what are called sectorial, so they only apply to certain industries or certain areas. The US is a great example. We do not have a comprehensive data privacy law, but we have laws like HIPAA, like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, financial services. And then some, like in Australia, they're a mix. There's a federal law, but there's also a lot of sectorial law. So those are a whole bunch of things that interlace, and you have to be aware of and focus on when you're in this area. And as we look out and we wonder, what's going to happen with data privacy, almost everyone goes first to GDPR, right? That's the most well-known. That's kind of the gold standard of data privacy, and there's a lot of work that has come off of GDPR and the implementation that went into effect a couple of years ago. And one of the big questions that I've seen and heard a lot about is, well, what's going to happen when the UK actually does, leave the EU? Because for now it's covered under GDPR, but afterwards, it's going to be treated just like any other third-party country. California, just recently, as of July 1, the Attorney General there is starting to enforce the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which does cover employee data. That's one of the things that you may not have focused on initially. And just because it's California, there's an entirely new ballot initiative going on that may dramatically change the CCPA sometime down the road as well. I mentioned federal laws like Gramm-Leach and HIPAA. And then a big question I think that's pending, especially in light of the California law, is will the US finally pass its own comprehensive data privacy law at the federal level? And we'll see. So next slide. The basics of data privacy, though, you don't really need to be a lawyer to get the basics, which is the good news. It is actually fairly straightforward when you cut through kind of all the noise. So here are the basics. First, there has to be a legitimate reason for processing personal data. You can't just decide to process it someday. There has to be a reason, a legitimate reason. You should only collect and process the data that you need, right? You need to get rid of the data that you don't need as soon as possible, so it's not sitting around for no good reason. You need to give notice to the individual about what you're processing and why you're processing it. And they need to have the ability, if something's wrong, they need to have the ability to correct it. There are, of course, special rules for sensitive data, health data, for example, sexual orientation, voter preferences, and any political data, anything like that has special rules around it. You need to keep the data secure. So you need to, do reasonable steps around data security, preventing data breaches, and of course, there are rules that happens if there is a breach. And then last, you need to give individuals choices around opting in and opting out, getting data deleted and copies, all of what you would consider just kind of basic rights around what you should be able to obtain or do with personal data that's been collected. If you are doing these things and you're paying attention to these things, you are going to hit easily the 80-20 rule, maybe even the 90-10 rule, right? You're gonna have you're gonna be in pretty good shape, which is a good place to be. Duty of care now is another obligation. So first we were talking about data privacy. Now we're going to talk about duty of care. And pretty much regardless of where you are in the world, but certainly in the United States, you have a duty of care to protect your employees, especially when they're traveling on company business. In the US, this is what we call both a statutory obligation. So there are laws that cover this, OSHA, workers' compensation laws, but there's also what we call the common law. And common law is really just how our legal system has developed over the past 250 years or so. Things aren't necessarily written down by Congress or state legislatures. There's actually law that develops from judges and decisions, and they rely on those decisions going forward, and changes are incremental and changes are slow. So that's the common law. The one thing I can tell you is I looked at a lot of the case law coming into this webinar today, is that it's very messy. It's not like there's a book that you pull off the shelf and it's all crystal clear what duty of care is. You have to parse through a lot of different obligations, a lot of different court cases, and some things that can seem contradictory at times. And of course, just to make it more interesting, if you have employees traveling internationally, depending on what country they're in, your corporation may then be subject to whatever the duty of care is in that country where your employee actually is. So those foreign laws may apply as well as the domestic laws of where you're operating. And the risk of harm, so what employers have to watch out for when employees are traveling, is a wide swath of things. It could be a terrorist incident. It could be government instability or civil unrest, acts of God, which cover things like volcanoes erupting and earthquakes. Your employees could just get robbed on the street corner, right? There's acts of violence. There's threats of kidnapping. What happens if they get sick? And of course, probably, one thing that's really common is if they're driving a car and they get into an accident, all of that rolls up underneath the employer and the duty of care obligations that employer is going to face. So next slide, please. Then, of course, you marry these together, right? So there are data privacy obligations and there are duty of care obligations. And how do those coexist? How do those live together? Anytime you're talking about employee data, employee information, now you're going to start triggering data privacy obligations. The good news is that they can and they do coexist. And that is something that if you're a travel manager or you're someone working at a corporation, you should take some comfort in that these are not mutually exclusive. Companies have a very clear and compelling interest in what we call location awareness, and Bruce is going to talk a lot about that. That is, in essence, being able to locate where your employees are in case of an event, if something happens. Dealing with employee health issues, what happens if your employee gets sick during travel, managing and capturing travel spend, what we call leakage. I know something near and dear to Traxo. I mean, that is something that companies should and do have an interest in. Who owns the data in the company's systems and its email systems? Again, something that employers have a clear, compelling interest in. And I would say, don't worry about little things like, oh, I'm going to capture a glimpse of my employees' personal data if they're using company sources to book travel, right? That may be there, but the privacy laws are flexible enough and have enough leeway that really going to be an issue at the end of the day, as long as you do some common sense things and take care of the right processes. And of course, what you're seeing, and I know this from personal experience, is that employees are mixing work and vacations more frequently. They may go on a work trip on a Thursday, Friday, and then turn that weekend into a vacation and bring their family along. So now you have a whole nother set of interesting issues that you have to take care of. And I know Bruce is a little bit more about some of those. So I think there's one more slide on my section. So these are the keys, right? So these, if I'm an in-house lawyer or I'm a travel manager working with an in-house lawyer, or I guess vice versa, these are the things that I would be focused on in terms of privacy and duty to care. So first, I want to make sure that we've identified what the company's legitimate interest is in the travel data, right? We spent some time, we've talked it through, and we've kind of zeroed in on what we need and why. And then we're truly limiting data that we're collecting, just what's needed. And it's not the business data, we're going to either discard it or not pay attention to it. And of course, how are that data secure? You want to have a written policy that everyone can look to, that everyone can read, that's consistent, it's consistently applied, and it tells everyone the basics of what we're collecting and why we're collecting it and what we're going to do with it. And once you have a policy like that, or any types of policies, you should always review those on a regular basis. Yearly is kind of the minimum. As the law changes or as things evolve, you need to change and update those policies more frequently. What you can't do, though, is just leave them on the shelf and let them gather dust. You need to frequently take a look at those and update those. Use common sense in everything you do. I cannot emphasize that enough. There is a lot of leeway for just using common sense in terms of complying with both duty of care and privacy obligations. And then lastly, if there are issues, you want to document those issues in writing, and you want to involve the entire group of people who need to be involved. So don't act in a silo, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not just a legal issue. It's not just a travel management issue. It's probably going to be a corporate security issue. It's probably going to be an HR issue, perhaps a finance issue. And you want to get all that input in whenever you're deciding to do anything, or whenever you're deciding to write anything down, or certainly whenever you're reacting to a situation like, say, an incident, a terrorist incident overseas, and you need to take care of your employees. That's not just something you should be going off by yourself. So that, I think, level view of the legal issues around privacy and duty of care. And now I'm going to kick it over to Bruce, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into certainly the duty of care aspect of that.
Great. Thanks, Sterling. Next slide. I'm going to start out setting some context around duty of care for companies, and the situation we run into with the companies that we work with is separating the trip and travel from the asset, which is the person. And, and I came into the industry in 1999, really focused the travel industry on travel risk management. And I think we were probably the ones at the time, IJET, that really defined this within the industry, and ultimately the travel risk management maturity model with GBTA. But that was just focusing on applying risk management to the trip. About 5 years ago, we had developed people risk management, which is really what duty of care matches to. It's the person that you don't want to harm. And you don't want to harm them anytime, whether they're coming into the office in a time of COVID, or whether they're on a long-term assignment, or working in the factory, or on a trip. Those are the full spectrums of things that the company is asking the employee to do, and they need to make sure that they're thinking about that and applying risk management to try to minimize harm to that employee. So that's the context. Next slide. And when you're talking about trips and travel and those kinds of things, you can't just like do a risk assessment, like for example, a piece of machinery in a manufacturing floor that somebody's using, and do a risk assessment and mitigate whatever potential harm could be by putting shrouding and proper protective equipment or whatever, and then maybe do that once a year or every couple of years. In the travel domain, things happen every minute of every day, and some of those things that are happening can impact your person, your asset that's out there in travel. And so we created a process model called continuous risk management to enable companies to understand and have a framework of kind of what are their obligations in being, one, awareness, right, which is the monitor step. And then when there is something, the next thing that has to happen is it relevant to my business? Is it relevant to my people? Is it relevant to this person that's now on a trip in a particular city or on a flight or whatever it may be? And then the notification phase is duty to warn. If you have knowledge, either foreknowledge, if it's warning, or incident, that potentially could impact your employee, you have a duty to warn them so that they can avoid it or act to preserve and reduce harm. And that's really what the next two are. If it's foresight, like it's going to be bad weather or there's civil unrest scheduled for Saturday or whatever, then you want to go through the prepare or avoid. And then of course, if it's an incident, having support to respond and recover that particular situation with that individual. And is in any process model around risk management is to always look at the outcomes and figure out, could we do any of this better to avoid problems in the first place? So that is risk management. This is a model that has you doing that on a continuous basis, which is why it's called continuous risk management. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with people, whether they're commuting, whether they're on holiday, whether they're on an assignment, whether they're helping a project at a client's facility, whether they're traveling around the world. It's a constant, consistent model all the time. Next slide. So one of the key elements that we work with when we bring this model in the juxtaposition of data privacy and data security is, what is the essential information that we need to do these things? And this is the typical set of information that we need. And there's several things in here that are problematic depending on what country you're working in, the country of citizenship and origin of the employee, whether it's in Germany, Sweden, whatever it may be. For example, mobile numbers become very touchy things in a number of jurisdictions, but they're important to have, especially for somebody that's mobile, traveling, and outside of their normal work environment. It's a critical thing to have in order to affect response. And so that's how you have to converse with the employee and maybe work councils or whatever to get them to agree to that. Of course, if we don't know where you're going ahead of time, and this is why Traxo collection of data is so critical and why we partner with them with a lot of our clients, is if I don't know where you're planning to go, I can't do risk management. If you book a trip outside the program and there's no awareness of it, and then you fly off to wherever, and then there's an issue, now it's incident management, not risk management. But when we know you're planning to go somewhere during a certain dates and times, then we can do the assessment and say, here's the things that you should think about mitigating before you go, whether it's kidnap or there's upcoming strikes or social unrest or whatever it may be, enables you to convey that, prepare for that, and minimize the potential impact to your employee. This also gives us location awareness while that person is in travel, as what is their plan. We're expecting them to be in New York, then we're expecting them to be in London, then they're going to Berlin, then they're coming back through Paris, and we generally know where you are. And that's why we don't like to use the term travel tracking. We don't track people's lat long and keep a history of that and know where they've been and all of that kind of stuff. We generally are happy if we just know kind of the city, or at least the neighborhood within a city, if it's a large city, is good enough for the general awareness. And then when we move to incident response, yes, we want to know your lat long so we can go help you out. Next slide. So when we talk then about this PII is separating it between what we're trying to do from managing risk, which is the proactive activities that the organization is doing, and then the reactive piece, which is saving lives. And again, it very starkly enables an employee and an organization to understand in different terms why you're collecting this data and why it's important. And when you're sitting here talking about that, if I don't have these kinds of capabilities and information when I'm trying to save your life, that gets people's attention. If I need this information to do a risk assessment and help protect you, it becomes relevant and important, but not as much as I need your phone number, your mobile number, or whatever number you're traveling with to help protect you. It separates and gets people focused on the data and why it's needed. Next slide. So I talked about this location awareness, and this term traveler tracking appeared in the early 2000s in the travel industry, and it has been the scourge of travel risk management ever since. People do not like to be tracked. It's just that simple. And when you use the term traveler tracking, it already gets people back on their heels and defensive and just don't want to deal with it. What we do in our system is we do not do that. When my app came up and I took this screenshot, I'm in Annapolis, Maryland. That's good enough. I don't need to know what restaurant I'm in or where I'm staying specifically or whatever I'm doing within the city. As long as I generally know you're here, that's good enough, because if something happens in Annapolis, I can get it to your phone. The phone can figure out how actually close you are to this issue and then push it to your screen and say, you need to pay attention to this, or just have it available and not bother them at that moment. That's all we need to do. And so that's why we really, really try to erase that whole term travel tracking, because when you get into Europe and other areas and other countries, it really causes a lot of problems. So again, if you can scratch that from your vocabulary, that would be awesome. Next slide. The other challenge that we have, and a lot of the framing of the conversation that I'm telling is this kind of intermediaries between the employees that are going to benefit from this, and whether it's a work council in Europe or whether it's a labor union in the United States or whatever it may be, you just have to be straight with them. This is what they're trying to answer, and this is what Sterling kind of went through in the whole privacy conversation. This is all they want to know, and they want to know the facts and they want to know the truth. And if you go through this and explain it, at the end of the day, they are going to be supportive of what you're trying to do. And the biggest issue that we ever run into is the fourth bullet. What happens to the data? Where is my data going? And what control do I have over telling you I don't want to give you the data, or if you have the data, that I can erase that data from my record? And if you can have this opt-out capability, and then ultimately opt-in for things that they do want to do, and allow them the right to be forgotten. So if they have their spouse in there with their spouse's phone number as emergency contact, and they don't want you to have that they can delete it and it's gone. We have never had issues with hundreds of major European countries and companies once we go through and they understand the level of control that the employee has around the program and around the data. That's the fundamental thing to open that up and have it work for you. Next slide. So the challenge now, since the start of the year, and Sterling weighed in on this, and that is that in the kind of COVID-19 environment, we're now dealing with health data. And to say that most of the industry and most of the companies and probably all the employees really don't understand the obligations and what's going on around their personal health information, especially when United Airlines throws a health survey at them and says, you need to fill this out before you can travel, right? It's very disconcerting. And most people are like, okay, yeah, I don't have a fever, da, 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 and they just do it, right? Without much thought. But then you have Emirates Air that comes in and says, we're gonna have you go over here and take a COVID-19 test. Well, should I do that? Like, what does a test mean? Are they gonna stick something down my nose, and is that really something I want done? Or are they gonna draw blood? And when they started this whole thing, they were actually taking blood pricks, just like you would for a diabetic, and they were doing antibody testing, which is not particularly useful, but do you really want an airline basically poking you and taking your blood? So that's the kinds of things that are happening out there right now. And it's not just airlines. When you're in China, I mean, basically you have a QR code that when you get it scanned, whether you're going on a train or the subway or moving around, going into a venue, that QR code gets scanned, and if it's green, you go in. If it's not green, you're denied. And then what is your recourse to figure out why you're no longer green, right? And dealing with that with the authorities. So that's what travelers are dealing with now. Every country right now has different standards and different things that they're doing. They're constantly changing. The United States has it on, times 50. When you have states that are saying, oh yeah, you can come visit us from Texas or wherever, but you have to go sit in your hotel for 14 days. And then we'll let you, run around our state, right? And those matches and what I call kind of bubbles, these states are in the green bubble and they can move around and be happy and do whatever they want to do, but these states are outside the green bubble and we're going to, treat them differently. That is right now on a US scale and a global scale, the biggest issues that we are dealing with right now. And I can't tell you at this moment, tomorrow or next week, what the rules are, because they're changing all the time. Okay, next. So what we've done, because our job is to collect that data and understand what's going on, we've built a tool to help travel managers and people that are planning on traveling to try to bring all of that data to one spot so that they're informed about not only the domestic travel restrictions, but also international travel restrictions in going to a particular country. And through the system, pushing updates because they are constantly changing. So you could already be on travel to Singapore and maybe onward to Japan, and the rules are changing while you're out there. What you don't want to do is end up out there and then not be able to get home for 14 days or longer, right? So that's what this is doing. And other agencies are doing this. American Express, Carlson, a lot of companies are in the travel, understand this is the problem, the challenge, and are putting information and capabilities together. We power many of those, but this is a key tool that you're going to need. Next slide. So bringing it back up to the company and other challenges. So at the enterprise level, companies, we're going to see a major rout of businesses, large and small, mostly small, that are not going to exist in the next 6 to 9 months because of this, the impact this is having on the economy and the ability for smaller companies to hang in there. They just don't have the capital resources. And so when you're thinking about your program and you're thinking about your partners and you're thinking about your business, a lot of people that you work with, especially with vendors in the travel industry, may not be there anymore. So the people that you were working with to deal with issues around travel and you know, your partners and people at your travel management company, and the travel management company itself may not be around, is very challenging within the environment here. Everyone that's looking, especially in the travel domain, understands that this is a long slog. We're looking at end of 2021, and the airlines are talking 2022, 2023, to see this very bumpy kind of return to some level of travel volume, but clawing back to pre-COVID travel will not happen for a long, long time because of other economic reasons and things that are happening, that people are just not going to travel, especially internationally, as much as they did before this. And so those are just ongoing challenges for the economic and business. Okay, that's weird. So when we look at the business travel itself and what's happening, there's no question, and we're starting to see some little glimmers that, you know, come pretty much in the September timeframe. We're going to see this ratcheting up and short bursts of business travel where there's kind of pent up demand, things that companies want to do. They want to get out there and meet with their clients and those kinds of things. And we're going to see that happen, and we're going to see some kind of light at the end of the tunnel picking up kind of in that September, October timeframe. The challenge is that that is going to run right into what is largely expected in anything that we're doing as far as analysis, that we're going to see a second wave that's actually going to be building on the first wave that we're in now that has never really got suppressed. So we're expecting, and as Fauci and others have said, this massive increase of cases on top of what we're dealing with right now, further stressed by seasonal influenza demand on the health system. Countries and the United States are going to be forced to pull back those suppression levers, and that's going to cause travel to dip again. And we're seeing in meetings and events and everything that's, you know, 2020 is largely dead to them, and everyone's looking at, you know, kind of early 2021 as potential for getting back to some level of face-to-face meetings, even though that's even questionable. So when we look at that, this again is this long slog of kind of getting through this thing and expecting, you know, kind of these bumps where, you know, kind of get going, and then we're going to have to pull back, and then we're going to get going again over the next, you know, end of 2021 into 2022. Obviously, when there's a vaccine, which I think everyone is very hopeful in Q1 of 2021, that's kind of where the consensus is. And then when you think about manufacturing, distribution, and actually dispensing it, we're looking at late 2021 to have a good set of, you know, vulnerable people, frontline workers, and a lot of the employed personnel to drive the economy getting that vaccine. But for the entire United States, 330 million people, that's going to take a year into 2022 to do that. But again, it's not, we don't need to get at that level to get the economy kicked in. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what we have to face here over the next, you know, 6 to 12 months for the basic travel function. Next. So in thinking about your company, and it's interesting to me, you know, I still work with a number of companies, not so much the big ones, the Global 2000, you know, they have their policies and they have their programs, and they understand that this is a people issue. It's not for the travel department to try to push a travel risk management policy. It's really the HR, risk management, global security that should be there carrying that torch, and travel should be there to support them to make sure you're covering the travel, you know, domain. But you know, having and reviewing those policies to be prepared for this and understand that things are going to come back in bumps, and it's going to vary from region to region. You have to have a much more dynamic, much more adaptable policy than just kind of one policy and it just sits there and people kind of do it. I talked about the TMCs issue. You really need to look at what you have for a TMC, and you may want to explore an online TMC as kind of a plan C, so that you always have a capability for your employees to make travel if you're disrupted by the loss of you know, a TMC you know, capability, if they go bankrupt or whatever it may be. I talked about travel data. It's not only important for the risk management function, but obviously for the company, for just understanding expense prior to travel. You know, it's a little difficult when somebody comes back and presents their voucher and says, I went on this trip and it was $8,000. Now you just have to deal with the employee. But if you see that up front, you can make decisions about that spend as well. So again, getting all of the travel plans up front are really critical at this time, both for safety and for expense control. Next slide. And then the other piece of this is around meetings. I think most companies have, you know, resolved about that they're not going to have in-person meetings for, you know, the foreseeable future. Most companies have projected work at home modality until January, early January. Most companies are kind of, that's the next evaluation period. So, you know, for the next 6 months, we're going to basically be working in the same model that we have been working in. And if you don't have a program around duty of care for your people, which includes then travel, there should be no excuse at this time to sit down with management or find partners within the organization that own the people asset as far as safety, security, health, and work with them to get a program in place so that you can address these issues in a professional way, provide that information and awareness to that employee so that they can make a good decision about what they're doing as far as travel, and you're doing the best thing you can possibly to help protect them and avoid them from harm, and make sure that you have an assistance capability so when they do have a problem or they are injured or they get COVID-19 in a foreign country, that you can help them out and hopefully get them home as quickly as possible. So next slide. Back to you, Chad.
Thank you, Bruce and Sterling. Thank you very much. That's great. A lot of great stuff. Yeah, it's so important to, as you said, to know exactly where they are. If you don't know where they are prior to traveling, you can't do anything about it. You can't measure, manage, or even care for what you don't see. So that's a very critical point. You said something in the end, and I'm going to go into the Q&A. Into one of the great questions we've had from our audience, which are, what suggestions do you have on how to get HR and legal involved in creating a duty of care policy? So, you know, we have to do it. We know we've got to get people involved. What are your suggestions on how to get that done?
Every organization is different, and every, you know, what I'll call kind of G&A department has different level of capabilities in a particular company. What you have to assess is who's your best partner to focus on this kind of an issue. For example, the legal department may be more of a processing department, or they could be very powerful and very influential. And if the general counsel says we need to get this done, it's done, right? Whereas maybe the HR department in your company, or even a health, safety, and environment department, or whatever it may be, you have to look at your company and culture and say, who's the best partner where duty of care and protecting our people is important and they have power. That's who you want to start with. And Starling, you have an opinion as well.
Yeah, I would just second that. One of the things you could do is, hey, I attended this great webinar on duty of care and send the link to you know, in HR or legal, depends on your relationships there. But I used to get, when I was general counsel, I would get notes like that from employees all the time. And I always felt as part of the legal department, one of our obligations was, even if we weren't necessarily the right group to do something, the response couldn't be, well, it's not us, just ignore it. We would go out and actively try to figure out who needs to be brought in, who needs to be part of this team. And a lot of the times legal would be part of that team. So I think you'll find your legal department generally proactive and willing to take the lead to get the right people together. But to some extent, it's just getting the issue in front of the right people, as Bruce says, and they should see the obviousness of it and the need to take action. And put that in place. If they're not,
the risk and liability of not having it in place.
Absolutely right. Even if you have an insurance in the company and you tell them about it, they'll probably be motivated to go get the right people together, because you know all of that's interrelated. All that ties together.
And it's actually interesting you mentioned insurance, because a lot of times people get hit by the company leadership to say, well, we have insurance for this. And your retort should be, insurance provides economic protection, not people protection.
That's right. Absolutely right.
And so that's just, put that in your, an arrow in your quiver.
In your arsenal of, of tools.
So coming back to Sterling and
Chad, I lost the volume.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Can anybody hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So Sterling, coming back to you, most of the questions are in the legal side. There was, companies interpret data privacy differently. You have similar companies, similar verticals, but they look at it differently. Do you think that COVID and the need for duty of care being brought to the forefront, that it's going to force companies to either tighten up the data privacy stance or loosen it a bit?
Is that from I'm not sure if that's from an internal standpoint. So you're looking at the data privacy obligations inward facing to the company. I think it could only lead them to probably tighten it in terms of just being more focused on it, understanding what they need, and taking the right steps to ensure that they gather what they need, but no more, that they have the policies in place, et cetera. If that's an outward facing question, so companies looking at data they collect from outside and they're bringing it in, boy, I hope so. If you are collecting personal health data from your customers, if you're doing fever scans, if you're having them fill out surveys, and you don't have the right procedure internally, you need to stop, and you need to go put those in place. Not stop maybe necessarily doing what you're doing, but you need to realize that there's more than just, okay, this is a good idea, let's go do it. And that's why I think it's important to always have the right people around the table, and not just doing it in a vacuum. It's not just legal, it's not just travel management, it's not just HR, but it's everybody together thinking through the issues and figuring out what you need to do.
Thank you.
Yep.
Another question for Sterling in the data realm. Can you confirm that as long as companies communicate to the traveler that any booking regarding using the corporate booking tool or email, they're okay to collect this data? So basically, as long as they let the traveler know they're going to collect it regardless of where it's booked, are they okay to do that legally?
Generally, yes. That policy should be in writing though, and it should be communicated not only people are hired, but we used to do at some of the companies I was with, we would have compliance training, and things like data would be part of the yearly training for all employees, and they had to sign a certification that I read everything and I did the training. So it's not something you can just post on the intranet and hope someone sees it. But if you things, I think absolutely that you're fine. If they're using company systems to book travel, especially corporate, but even personal, I would say, if you're using our systems, we have a justification to see what information is going through our systems and why.
Yeah. And what I've always heard is the fundamental thing, this is a financial obligation to the company that they're paying for. So that's policy focuses on, and they have the right to that data because it's something they're paying for both making decisions about what and also auditing. On the other, on your leisure travel, that it comes to systems usage and the fact that you're on the systems, whether you're doing personal emails or whether you're doing, and again, that's the general construct there, as long as your policy says that that's what you're going to do. As far as them capturing, retaining leisure travel, that becomes more problematic.
I agree.
And again,
agree.
it has
Yep.
to be covered by policy. But the fact that you are booking through the company and the company's paying for it, I don't know anywhere that there's not an expectation that the company has access to that data and retain it.
Bruce, coming back to you, what
Okay.
concerns do you have with the various apps countries are requiring visitors?
I can answer this question right out. Always use a travel phone, whether you rent one or take it. You really should not use your personal phone in most countries, especially there's probably 20 or 30 countries which you absolutely shouldn't. And what you load on your travel phone, deal with it while you're there, because for a lot of countries, the back doors are so well known. For example, there's software that the Chinese, want you to load around banking and transactions and that kind of stuff that have been evaluated by security companies. And there's like 4 back doors. And once you load it, within an hour, it comes up and creates a linkage to some remote database. So this is well known. And the answer is don't put stuff on your phone, especially if it's mandated. Get a temporary phone, and that's what you should use to travel, or have your personal phone and a temporary phone to manage these kinds of things. Okay.
So coming back to travelers and not following policy, there was a question about how should the issue of travelers not following policy, even though they've been given policy, they sign a document saying that they'll follow the policy, but they continue to break it. What recourse do the companies have in that aspect?
Sterling, start with that one.
Yeah, I'll start with this. I mean, you should follow your normal employee discipline policies, just like you would in the normal course if they were doing something else that violated company policy or whatever. And as long as you're treating everyone the same, you're not discriminating against anyone. And it would be anywhere from a reprimand potentially to termination. It depends on the seriousness of it. But if you have a policy and they're not following it, in most places that's going to fall squarely within whatever the employer's rights are around disciplining employees and even terminating employees.
One last question that we have, and then I think I'd love to get some closing thoughts on you, which is in the same vein, is can an employee opt out of sharing their business trip itineraries with a travel team? I think we touched on this. If the company is paying for the trip, it's business purposes, don't they have a right to know of those data, what the data is, so they can help comply with that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any place where if it's business travel and the company's paying for it, that the employee could say, I'm not going to share that with you. This feels like a very, very rare instance that would be acceptable. Just about anywhere in the world.
Same here. I've never heard of any company allowing their employee to opt out of sharing their itinerary and journey plan.
Well, thank you guys very much. This concludes the Q&A portion of it. And I just really, before we wrap up here, we've got about 5 more minutes. I want to get some closing thoughts. So Sterling, will come to you. Give your closing thoughts on everything we talked about today and what you see go forward.
Yeah, I think I would say 3 things. Company travel managers, the people who are operating travel programs, you should feel empowered to get the information that you need, as long as you follow some common sense and basic parameters. That there's nothing untoward about understanding where employees are located or understanding travel spend, especially if the company's paying for it. Have a written policy. that covers this. Make sure it's not developed in a vacuum, that you have more than just, one group of people or one section of company putting in a lot of input into what's going to work and why. And then finally, as I just alluded to, common sense is your best friend. If you think about what's reasonable, if you do what's reasonable under the circumstances, you will generally be okay, even if you don't necessarily know exactly what the answer is. Just keep common sense at the forefront. And then I would also say, Chad, for anyone, if we don't get to your questions, I don't know if you have contact information you're giving out, I'd be happy to talk to people or answer questions offline when this is over. I know we're probably gonna run out of time here soon.
Yeah, we can do that. And I will also be forwarding the questions, and we will do a blog post afterwards with some answers. But
Great.
I've been a couple of questions about contacting y'all, so we'll be sure to get that out there. Bruce, to you on the closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to take it to the human element. Everyone in the travel domain, whether they're travelers or us, trying to support travelers, we are all under mental, emotional stress. And so it's an incredibly important time that we recognize that all parties are having challenges. And every traveler, except maybe some that are just completely oblivious to the risk, are going to be anxious about traveling. And therefore, they're going to be peppering questions at you and things that are going to hit you that you may think you know the answer to, but then has changed underneath you, right? And or they're going to ask you about why I have to do this or that or whatever. So kind of just getting a feel of what we've talked about today so that you can communicate to them why this is important and what's happening and what to expect will help reduce anxiety and provide a supportive environment. I just feel like right now, everybody's got to do their best to be kind, be informed as best they can, with the caveat that it's changing all the time.
Thank you. And thank you guys again for today. We really appreciate it. Jack, if you could go forward one slide, just two final housekeeping issues. To learn more about our solutions and solutions for traveler safety, please visit www.traxo.com/traveler-safety. There was one final question about where we can find the recording for future reference. So we will be sending out a link to that recording to all of the attendees and those who have not attended that registered. But we've done some past webinars. So please go to blog.traxo.com to find all of the Traxo office hours webinars. There has been some other office hours that have popped up that is not Traxo. So this is where you can find out where the past 4 office hours presentations were. Once again, thank you, Sterling. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, all of the attendees. And from sunny Dallas, Texas, we bid you a happy Wednesday and have a great rest of the week.
Good. Thank you.